Now it's my great pleasure to invite Dr. Varmus to the stage for our Q&A session, so please get your pens ready. While Dr. Varmus is making his way, I'd like to announce that the Graeme Clark Institute and the Bionics Institute have signed a term sheet with a major investor to develop a device to manage epilepsy based on Graeme Clark's original work that will change the life of people with epilepsy. This is literally hot off the press. I'd also like to announce the partnership with the Centre for Sensory Neural Engineering in Seattle around ethics approval of the Graeme Clark Institute's work. So they're two major breakthroughs, and congratulations to the Graeme Clark Institute for those. So the format now is I'll chat to Dr. Varmus for about 10 minutes and then we'll open it to questions from the floor. So I wanted to start with your personal journey. So from literature to the editor of a student newspaper to medical research, and I just wondered whether the varied interests that you've had and the pathway you went to before you got to medical research, do you think that that's helped you in your chosen field? Has it helped with the success and has it impacted?
Well, I think it helps in the sense that, that in two ways. One, being immersed in literature and still having a deep interest in many forms of the arts and humanities just makes me enjoy life more. That's important. But secondly, one thing you discover when you do science is how important it is to communicate, whether it's through talks or writing directly about your work or writing reviews or writing editorials. The linguistic skills that come with a background in literature are incredibly helpful, and I find it unfortunate when I meet people who love science so much that they ignored everything else about the arts and humanities that both enrich a scientific career and simply enrich life.
I wondered too the roles that you've had where you've been liaising with, politicians at the top of their game. You've had to negotiate for funding. You've managed to do that really successfully. And I wondered whether some of that sort of greater breadth that you've demonstrated in your own personal journey has fed into that. Did that make you better at doing that mixing and mingling? Did it make you less of a boffin and more of a person when you were meeting people who may or may not have known about?
I'm not sure that's true, but I do think that demonstrating some enthusiasm for what you do, and frankly, although this seems crass, having that little medal that says you're good at it helps a lot.
Yes.
My friend David Baltimore, Nobel laureate 1975, often said to me, "This thing comes in handy." And, even when I was a bad boy at the NIH and made some mistakes, Congress still was kind to me because they liked being in the presence of, I don't feel inherently any different than anybody else, but I know that having this little trinket, which haunts you from time to time, but is also a shield against calumny, it's a good thing.
I wondered whether not only is it a shield, but if it's a magic key, does it open doors that wouldn't otherwise be open? Do people listen to you expressing the same views?
I mean, I think there's a danger, and I see some of my colleagues who have perhaps reduced their level of scientific engagement and spend more time being Nobel laureates than being scientists, can begin to overuse this little tool. And it is dangerous. Every day my mailbox has something about something that I could sign, and it's dangerous to sign these things if you don't really understand the issues. So when I first heard word of this prize, I got a very instructive letter from Jim Watson, whose picture you all saw tonight, saying that the one thing you should not do is, after the Nobel Prizes, congregate with other Nobel laureates in any place except Stockholm, because they're over they're over their peak, and they're just getting together and enjoying Nobelitis, and it's a dangerous disease.
I wonder about I've spoken to some really great researchers, but when I talk to them about fundraising opportunities and things like that, sometimes there's a groan that I'd really rather be doing what I do than have to go out and ask people for money.
Well, that may be true, but you do need money to do research. And frankly, I always enjoyed fundraising, whether it was fundraising from Congress or fundraising from donors at Sloan Kettering, because you're dealing with people who have an interest in science. The money is important, and it's not something I do with the sense that I'm robbing the rich to allow the poor to do the work. I feel as though I'm establishing a collaboration between someone who would like to see us get where we think science could take us and scientists who can take us there. And that seems like a marriage that needs to be made, and sometimes it needs to be made by people who are willing to spend that extra time of nurturing the relationship. But, I spent 10 years running Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is an institution that does depend very heavily on donors. We have an easier job than most institutions because many of our donors are relatives of patients or patients themselves, and they have reasons to care about the institution. But I also always felt that I thought we'd use the money well. The people who came to see me about this wanted to learn what we did. I didn't need to take them to dinner at the fanciest restaurant in New York. I could have a simple lunch and bring in one or two young investigators to say what they were doing, and we all enjoyed it. And I think one of the mistakes people make in fundraising is to try to treat the donors to some kind of fancy event, as opposed to telling them about the exciting work that we want the money to be spent on. So once you start with that presumption that fundraising is about telling the good story of the work that's going to get done, that's being done and will get done with the donor's money, then you have an interaction which is actually educational and interesting for everybody.
Philanthropy in Australia doesn't have the standing that it has in the US. It's not as it's not as widespread. Mm-hmm. It's not as well established, and so
are donations tax exempt?
Yes, often. Well, the organisation has to have the exemption status, but then yes. But nevertheless, it's still not as widespread as it is in the US. And a lot of our researchers spend a lot of time, like several months in any year, applying for grants, and 15% would be successful. That'd be the hit rate.
If they had
basically
majored in literature, they'd be better at writing grants, and they could spend less time doing it.
Well, there's a tip. So major in literature first.
I'm always suspicious of people who say they spend half their time writing grants. Now, I write a lot of grant applications, but it doesn't really take that much time if you're able to.
So you think? I think we just got a headline. So do you think they're poorly written, they're too long, or they're?
Well, I do think that funding agencies often make a mistake in requiring too much paperwork and requiring applications that are too long, because once you require a long application, it's all about the methodology. And let's face it, boys and girls, you don't need to write down all the methodology to have a good application. But what's important are the ideas. To quote Jim Watson again, Jim, hope he's thanking me, Jim once said, if you've got something to say, you can say it in 10 minutes. And I think that's true of a grant application too. If you've got something interesting to propose, you can propose it in 5 pages. Even
taking that into account, we still would have far more people looking for grants than there are grants available.
That's another kind of problem. That's the problem of balancing the demographics of science with the resources. And frankly, in the U.S. at this point, we have a serious problem with that. And some people actually blame me. They say, you worked with Congress to get the budget doubled for NIH in 5 years, but you didn't persuade Congress to continue the increases in the out years. And, we made the point that you can't just increase the budget rapidly for 5 years and then fail to pay attention to it. And that was part of our problem. The scientific community grew. Many, many more postdocs coming to America and then looking for jobs. And we ended up with a Malthusian dilemma. We had too many people, too little resources. And that's a situation that persists. One of the things that is particularly troubling about what's going on right now is that if you look at the demographics of grant holders from the NIH, whereas at one time, most of the grant holders were in their 30s and 40s, now most of them are in their 50s and 60s. And it's very difficult for young people to get grants. It's very hard to start an independent research career until you're in your early 40s. And we are trying, and I say we, I mean a bunch of apostates who call ourselves the Rescuing Biomedical Research Group, are trying to follow some of the things that are being done in Europe. The European Research Council has a program that takes a very large segment of the grant budget and allocates it to investigators who are within 7 years of their PhD. That's a good thing. It means that you level the playing field for young investigators and put them in a special category. I think that's really healthy for long-term investments in science. Right now, we don't have mandatory retirement in the States. The number of people, myself included, who are over 70 and taking NIH money is rapidly increasing. I refuse to say that we should not be able to compete for grants just because we are at a certain age. But I think it's a mistake from a public policy point of view not to have some money allocated for people in their early 30s, mid-30s who are trying to start research careers.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was some of the social media giants like Google and Facebook and the amount of money that they're putting into medical research. And I don't know, have you followed that?
Well, I think we need to be careful about this. First of all, I'm not aware of
the
Google putting money into
Foundation,
research. They do have Verity, and I know you had Tom Insel here last year, although he's no longer at Verity. But I have to, in full disclosure, I have to say that I'm a member of the advisory board for Chan Zuckerberg, and I applaud what they do. They're doing some interesting things, trying to organize science in innovative ways. But although their budget for research sounds impressive, $3 billion over 10 years, that's 1% of what NIH spends. NIH spends over $30 billion a year. They're spending $300 million. What's more, although I applaud what they do, and indeed am part of what they do, they, in general so far, are giving money to highly successful scientists who are already pretty well funded. And I think what is more problematic is how to nurture the scientific community so that we have science being done broadly across the country, in part, not just because we think every person who's trained with a PhD or an MD and has a research background ought to have some kind of entitlement to do research, but because it is useful to the country to have every major institution training individuals, young students and graduate students, in an atmosphere that has an active research program at the frontiers. So I like seeing all these major institutions at least receiving some funds from the NIH so that every training environment is being supported by federal funds and doing good research.
I suppose the only other part of that then is if you've got private investment in, and we've always had private investment in research, but if they're setting up their own organisations to do research rather than investing in research that's already underway, is there a concern that some of the outcomes out of that might not be for public good as such, but more for, corporate output?
No, at least I can only speak to the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, which I'm intimately involved with, and that initiative is in particular taking great pains to ensure that, first of all, the work is done on a collaborative basis. Indeed, one of the special features of the two things they've been doing so far ensure that there's multi-institutional collaboration. Centers working through a hub in the Bay Area that includes the three major institutions there. Secondly, the Chan Zuckerberg initiative has been focusing on the way in which science is shared and communicated. So they've made investments in getting scientific findings published immediately. In fact, being contributed to what we call preprint servers, where work is exhibited through the internet to anybody who wants to see it, even before it's been peer-reviewed by journals. So the notion of sharing results, moving science faster, is implicit in what Chan Zuckerberg has done so far, and none of it is related to any of the corporate efforts that are in the for-profit sector.
We're going to open up to the floor now.
Varmus, you gave a fantastic talk tonight, and I enjoyed it very much. I wondered what you have learnt about life from your years in research. And I particularly noted one comment you made, which was that DNA was an accident.
DNA was
An accident.
Well, I didn't say DNA was an accident, but I do think that the origin of life is probably an accident. It probably happened only once in a way that was sustaining. I do think, I wouldn't call it a miracle, because I don't really believe in miracles, but I do think it was an extraordinary exception. And when I look around, I always find myself amazed that life is here in the form in which it's here. And it makes me very concerned about what we're doing to this one little speck in the multi-universe. I'm not sure that's the nature of your question, but I think one of the things that I've learned being a scientist is the improbability of this all being a thing that has happened, and finding myself with an immense respect for the fragility of it all.
There's one down here.
My name is Professor McRae. To what extent is the NIH influenced by whichever government's in power in the United States, and in particular whether the moonshot is going to be influenced by the current regime, or whether that's all independent of the government in place?
Yeah, well, you're asking some tough questions here. I would say in general, the NIH has been pretty immune from partisan politics. Certainly when I was director of NIH, we had a Democratic president, largely a Republican Congress, and my support support for the agency came from both sides of the aisle with pretty equal measure. In fact, you could argue that the Republican side was even more supportive than the Democrats having a lot of other things that they would like to see federal money used for. I do think that I'll come to the moonshot in a minute. I do think that we are at a very delicate moment here in the history of American science, because for the first time in my recollection, we have a president who has no understanding of science, no conviction about the nature of evidence, no compelling recognition of how the strength of America, indeed the strength of the world, is dependent upon government investment in science. He hasn't appointed people to the many responsible positions that are required to run science agencies effectively. He's tried to cut the NIH budget deeply. He's tried to remove the federal money that goes to support facilities and administration, which would be a death blow to our university system. So we have a serious threat to what we do that is the result not of a Republican being elected president, because I'm not sure that Donald Trump actually is a Republican. He's a maverick who got elected as a Republican candidate. However, our country, unlike yours and Great Britain's, is not a parliamentary democracy. It's a democracy based on checks and balances. It does things very inefficiently, and the change of the kind that Mr. Trump seemed to like to impose on science is going to happen extremely slowly, if at all. Up until now, his proposals to cut the budgets and restrict certain kinds of payments to universities have been rebuffed by everyone, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and science has remained fairly protected. Now, it is interesting that while Mr. Trump has been assiduous in his efforts to try to destroy anything that Obama did, good or bad, and yet he has not revoked a number of things that Barack Obama, who was perhaps the most the greatest science enthusiast I've seen in the White House, and I've seen several people come and go. So the BRAIN initiative to study the basic wiring of the brain with an eye toward treating neurodegenerative diseases, the precision medicine initiative, the moonshot initiative, these have been left in place. We may not get all the money we need to support them, but he has not tried to take these things apart, even though he's trying to destroy Clinton's NAFTA and the Pacific trade agreements that Obama worked out, and he's made a great effort to try to destroy the climate change agreements in Paris and Obama's efforts successful efforts to work out a nuclear treaty with Iran. He has not focused on the science agreements that have been established over the course of the last several years. So the moonshot is a funny kind of thing. It's not entirely clear where the money is coming from, and I actually think the moonshot is not about money. It's about developing enthusiasms, building collaborations, making an enumerated list of things that we need to focus on. I would argue that most of the things in that list were already being reasonably well supported, but it's important to get public support for what our science agencies do, and having a coordinated effort to list the most important items in the cancer research agenda, even if they were things that were already recognized, is a very, very useful exercise in public education about science. So, the moonshot obviously would be in somewhat different condition if we had a Democrat, a friend of Joe Biden's, still running it. It's not entirely clear to me what the moonshot is right now, except that it's still an emblem that we can put on the National Cancer Institute's efforts to accelerate cancer research. Biden was very smart. He didn't say, I want to cure pancreatic cancer in 3 years. He said, I want to see cancer research proceed at twice the pace it would have otherwise. And while I don't know if we can achieve twice the pace, we can always go faster. To me, it's always more important to say, we're going to invest more in medical science to get there faster. One mistake that's commonly made is saying, we're going to put money into a branch of medical research because we want to cure disease X in 5 years. That is in my view, always an inappropriate thing to say. It rarely gets achieved. The public gets disillusioned. It's better to say, we're going to put emphasis on this, and we're going to move faster. We're going to get people to work together. That's an operational principle that is not mission-focused in a way that's inappropriate for something that requires basic discovery to move more quickly.
We had a question at the back.
Colin Seeger, thank you for your oration today. It was mind-boggling. I just wanted
Is that
to
good or
ask
bad?
you- Oh, no,
Boggling.
in a good way. That's why I'm drinking.
Okay, thank you. Me too.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a number of times the importance of research and collaboration and information exchanges and the importance of peer review, all the rest of it. And I'm wondering, have you seen, or do you have any views about the tendency towards paywalling research information, this quarantining and siloing of research information and proprietizing it where it's either publicly funded or is funded by special interest groups? Has that any impact? Do you see where that will go?
Well, actually, I think that the paywalling of scientific information has diminished dramatically in the last 15 years, and it's done so in at least 3 ways. The first was the construction of public digital libraries such as PubMed Central, which initially had slow uptake, but mainly because journals who are in many ways the villains of the piece, and I mean not just for-profit journals, but also society journals published by certain societies that depend on profits from their journals to fund their meetings and other things, once the resistance of those journals to creating a public digital library was overcome, and that required not just persuasion, but it required Congress to say, we pay for this research, we want the public and people at every institution to see it, and they created a mandate that all work supported, even in part by the NIH, be contributed to the digital library, PubMed Central, within a year. That had a great deal to do with knocking down some of these barriers. The second thing was the creation of open access journals that have a fundamentally different business plan. The author, that is the author's research sponsor, like the NIH, pays a small fee to have the work published and immediately placed online and accessible to everybody. And the third has been a more recent development in biology, but reflecting a now 25-year-old tradition in physics, computational sciences, and astrophysics to make work available over the internet even before peer review. I believe peer review is useful, but I think peer review has abused its privileges in many ways. It's now common for people subjecting their work to peer review at some of the most prestigious journals to wait as long as 1 to 2 years before their work becomes published, because the journals themselves are very concerned about maintaining their high ranking by ensuring that everything they publish is going to be highly cited, in part by reviewers who ask unnecessary questions. It isn't, in my view, necessary for a work to answer every nuance in the experiments that are being portrayed, to have the ideas and the fundamental results published and made available to the scientific public. So speeding up the distribution of findings by allowing people to post their preprints before review on so-called preprint servers, making that work available for scrutiny and criticism at an early stage is a very healthy thing, and it speeds up research. I don't think there's been an increase in what you may call the paywall. I think we've been bringing the paywall down in the 3 categories that I mentioned over the past 15 years.
We had a question over here. Yes?
I've heard very few questions from the distaff side, and I see a very nice woman here in white and black with her hand up.
Hi, Crystal Evans from the BioMelbourne Network. Thank you very much. I'm just in the middle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your elegant presentation and your very insightful comments this evening. I wanted to reflect on something Professor Graeme Clark said about the 5 I's and what we need to do here in Melbourne to foster a culture of commercialisation to ensure that research ideas and discoveries are translated into impact for patients.
Sure. Well, I'd be happy to comment on that. I didn't speak about that tonight, in part because I wanted to keep the oration within limits, and in part because some of the things I said were implied a very deep commercial involvement. Namely, I talked about drugs and diagnostics that are changing the landscape of cancer care and cancer research that obviously are being carried out by commercial firms. Furthermore, I believe that there has been a major change in biomedical research over the last 20 or 30 years, with industry and academia coming much more closely attuned to each other. The biotech industry, of course, being a product of academia. Most biotech firms are started by people in academia, and I've been influenced by that in many ways. I've been, for the last year or so, helping Mayor de Blasio with an initiative to spend $500 million over the next 10 years to improve the biotech industry in New York. I strongly believe that all of us who are doing basic medical research like to feel that there is an outlet for stuff that we do that has the prospect of being commercially useful. I myself am not interested in running a biotech company, but I do enjoy working with people who are running those companies. I'm on 3 advisory boards myself, and I think that any municipality or district can help with the foster commercial development of the work being done in the region, and that's an effort which enriches the academic experience and helps patients ultimately by getting results from basic research laboratories into a commercializable and usable form. Nevertheless, all that is important, but it's got to be done with care, because it's very easy to see situations develop in which the commercial interest can corrupt academic standards. And I do think that when we foster those interactions between academic and commercial institutions, that we have to do so with very clear rules about exploitation of students, about turning the heads of academic laboratories into entrepreneurs in their situations in which they should be, their primary fealty should be to the study of natural phenomenon, and the commercial parts of their lives need to be placed under certain constraints so that the primary motive of these folks in their academic lives is represents a loyalty to scientific principle.
Hello, my name is Leah. I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, and I was invited here tonight on behalf of WISE, which is Women in Science and Engineering. We're a student organisation at the University of Melbourne. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, mostly because you brought up the gender parity question. So much like the NHS in the United Kingdom, you need an Athena's or a Bronze Award in order to get funding over there. And I was wondering what role, if any, do you think that government funding bodies like NIH or in Australia, the NHNWC, have in pushing for and striving for gender parity at high-level academia?
Well, I think there's a definite role for these organizations to pay attention not just to gender inequity, but also to cultural and ethnic inequalities. I know that there is a persistence of inequality in the academic community. That's been demonstrated by a number of social science experiments. My favorite one is one that was carried out by Jo Handelsman and her colleagues at Yale a couple of years ago, in which they sent letters requesting faculty positions around to different faculties. Same letters with the signature of with a male name and with female names, and the responses were very different depending on whether the letter writers were perceived to be male or female. So we know that there are inequities in the way we perceive or interpret letters, even at that very early stage where no money is involved, just an invitation to come and give a seminar. So actually how a funding organization like NIH should pursue those concerns is not entirely clear to me, but it is within their realm of responsibility. And the NIH, some of you may know, has been accused of portraying through its study sections some prejudice against African American applicants. Those findings are being carefully studied by a large group commissioned by the advisory committee to the NIH director. No clear answers have emerged. But if your question is there a responsibility to try to root out any evidence of inequity and try to make whatever corrections can be made, I think the answer to that is yes. If you're a funding body and you're in the public institution, or for that matter, a private institution, responsibility to the higher ethic of equity is very high.
We'll take one over here, and I think we've probably only got time for one more after this. So if you're burning for a question, please pop your hand up.
They're
Up the back.
burning over there. They're burning.
Oh, and over here. So we've got
They're waving
1,
wildly.
2, 3, and then we'll be done.
Okay.
So Harold, you'll have to keep your answers short.
Okay, all right. Shorter answers, I'm told.
Name is Jim Patrick, Chief Scientist Emeritus from Cochlear Limited. I have to say, first of all, on collaborations with researchers, we have collaboration programs with like 100 different facilities around the world.
Good.
And they're really, really important. And those scientists keep their outcomes and so on. We get to use the results of it, though. So it really is important to have good collaboration between the companies and the researchers. Your presentation, your oration this evening was just brilliant. And thinking about it, your communication skills are fantastic. Thinking about now the kids that we're putting at school really focusing on the science and maths, we really need to make sure that as well as doing that, they learn to communicate. To me, that is something that you kind of lose with the focus on the science and maths. It really needs to be, I guess, added to that program to make sure that they can communicate as well as be able to use the technology that they've got. And I don't know if you've seen something like that happen in a different place, but I'd be appreciative of your comments.
Well, I certainly subscribe to your comments, whether I don't have any simple answers to the question of how you encourage people to learn to communicate. When I went to Amherst College, as so many years ago, I don't want to mention it, we were all required to take a public speaking course. That actually was pretty useful. I hated it at the time, but actually it was useful for us to get up there and have to face an audience and talk on a topic we didn't know much about.
Good practice. There's a question up the back. Yes?
These folks are so
yes.
eager, though. They're waving their arms wildly.
They've got the microphone. They're going to be
Yeah,
next.
They've got the microphone. They've got an advantage.
So I think the switch, yes?
Hello, my name is Eduardo. Thanks for your presentation. I'm from the Department of Medicine, the University of Melbourne. My question may be a little bit different to the previous one. I was wondering whether cancer may serve a sort of purpose for human race. When I say purpose, I'm not saying anything in particular, but I was wondering whether there is any reason for cancer to exist for human race.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think that cancer serves a useful purpose for a human being who experiences it. That, to me, I wouldn't be doing what I do if I thought that. But I do think that your question raises something that I tried to address earlier in my talk, which is that cancer is one manifestation of a fundamental principle in biology, which is that mutations or changes in our DNA are going to occur because of the way replication of cells occurs. And if we didn't have error, we wouldn't have diversity. If we didn't have diversity, we wouldn't have the vast array of remarkable species that we have. We wouldn't be who we were. We wouldn't have evolved to be what we are. So cancer fascinates me from that philosophical perspective of being a representation in the form of disease of the thing that drives human life to be as complex and interesting as it is. Let's have these folks. They may have something incredibly important to say that none of us can avoid missing.
Very patient.
So I wanted to actually go to the issue of treating cancer. So at the moment, we try and cure cancer. So when someone gets it, we try and remove it from the body. Do you see from the work you've done that the chances are now to be able to treat cancer and treat it as something which is ongoing over a long period of time rather than trying to cure it and the possibility of reoccurrence?
Look, no one is going to welcome the idea of spending the rest of their lives controlling their cancer if it could be cured. So I think there's no doubt that cure is still our objective. My personal objective is preventing as many cancers as we can, recognizing we're unlikely to prevent them all, but finding cancers at a very early curable stage, preventing cancers that are caused by exposure to mutagenic agents in the environment or caused by behaviors like smoking. That's a laudable objective. But if we are able to control over many years cancers which otherwise would be lethal within a year, that's a remarkable advance. And I think we're all willing to accept the idea that if we found a drug that would allow someone to live a healthy life with the persistence of a pancreatic cancer as opposed to dying of pancreatic cancer within a year, we would take that as an advance. Cure still remains the objective, but I think we have to accept the idea that it would also be victory to be able to create a chronic situation in which patients are fundamentally healthy, but they have not eliminated every cancer cell from their body. We have that situation with AIDS. You cannot stop treatment for HIV, and people are healthy living with HIV in their body as long as they can avoid the toxicity of drugs they currently take. I see my MC staring at me. That answer is a little too long. It's over.
I was interested. You're misreading me. But we do have the final question down the back.
Hi, my name is Isabel Evans and I'm from Patterson River Secondary College. And I'm just letting you know I really loved your presentation today.
Thank you.
My question is, what do you think are the challenges for young scientists like me in the future? And what will your advice be for me to continue my passion and love for science?
Well, look, I don't really know enough. Yeah, I applaud your passion. It's difficult for me to give you advice without knowing a lot more about you. As my wife knows, I don't like to give general advice. I like to give advice for a specific person. If you love science, study it and make a decision about what you're going to do with your career, but make it based on a number of things. First, recognizing that loving science and knowing a lot about it, even being good at it, opens a lot of potential careers. One of the mistakes that we senior academics have made over the years is to teach to give a picture to students that a scientific life is one lived at a university, running a large laboratory, and being immensely successful. That's not something that happens for everybody, but there are lots of ways to be successful, happy scientists, even without doing experiments day by day. And we need to let people know when they love science that there are lots of ways in which science can be important in their careers and in their lives. But going beyond that to tell you what you should do with your love of science is something I'm very reluctant to preach from this platform because I don't know enough about the nature of your interests. And if you want to try to catch me during dinner, I'd be happy to try to sort that out. But I think the important thing to remember is there are lots of ways to exploit your love of and accomplishments in science without necessarily getting into what is currently a highly competitive atmosphere in academic science in which the ability to acquire grant support and succeed is frankly inhibitory to a satisfactory way of life.
So maybe you'd like to find Dr. Varmus afterwards and have a chat one-on-one.
No.
Well, that does bring us to the close of the questions. I'm sure we could go on for a long time. It's been a fabulous intellectual journey with you all this evening, especially with Harold Varmus, how lucky we've been to spend this time with him. I'd like to acknowledge the great work done by all those behind the scenes, those who are serving us the lovely meal. We're supposed to have been finished in time for sweets, but hey, we've run over a little. I think it was worth it. In particular, I'd like to thank Luan Ismail for his dedication and determination to ensure that the Graeme Clark Oration goes from strength to strength each year. I'd also like to remind you that the Cosmos is available at the end of the room, so help yourself if you didn't get one on your way in. And as the formalities draw to a close, could I just invite you one more time to thank Dr. Harold Varmus for his generous time this evening.